could I ask you to love me when I knew you loved Rebecca still? Whenever you touched me, I knew you were comparing me with Rebecca.
What is the mystery of Rebecca? What dread secret is hidden within the silent walls of Manderley?
It's not only in this room. It's in all the rooms in the house. You can almost hear it now. Do you think that they'd come back and watch the living?
Welcome to a new episode of Foreign Correspondence Deeper into Hitchcock podcast. My name is Michał Leszczyk and I'm joined as always by my co-host
Sebastian Smoliński. Hello.
We are proceeding with our project of a podcast dedicated to the work of Alfred Hitchcock that we try to analyze from Eastern European perspective. And we are going steadily proceeding through the filmography of Alfred Hitchcock. And now we arrive at a very exciting moment, as exciting as truly discovering a new world. Hitchcock is discovering America with Rebecca, his first American Hollywood production, a film that actually won the Best Picture Oscar for the year 1940. So it's the only Hitchcock film that managed to accomplish that feat. And today we are accomplishing another feat by inviting a wonderful guest. Our guest today will be a Hitchcock scholar and also a Rebecca scholar, Professor Patricia White, who is a professor of film and media studies at Swarthmore College in the US. She wrote many books, including Women's Cinema, World Cinema, Projecting Contemporary Feminisms, and Uninvited, Classical Hollywood Cinema and Lesbian Representability. And recently, actually very recently, she published a brand new study, a short book in the BFI Classics series entirely devoted to Rebecca. So we are extremely honored that Professor Patricia White will be joining us on this podcast, and I can sense that Sebastian is also very excited about that because we also both liked Rebecca.
Yes, we love Rebecca and we love coming back to Manderley, as Professor Patricia White also likes. So I'm very happy we have such a wonderful guest today.
Absolutely, and we are looking forward to discussing many aspects of Rebecca. Of course, I guess today there are no true Eastern European tropes, apart from Franz Waxman,
Yes,
who wrote music for Rebecca and who was born in Chorzów, near my hometown, Nowtarskie Góry. But apart from that, we are deeply in the Gothic imagination.
That's right. And there is also a Selznick memo, and Selznick writes that if the war will come to America and to UK, they will be in a big pickle, almost as big as Poland. I mean, not as big, he writes, but almost as big as Poland. So that's the Polish connection, of course.
And we can tell you as Poles that was quite a pickle, the war. Well, anyhow, it is a great pleasure for us to welcome the wonderful Hitchcock scholar, Professor Patricia White.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. We are very honored and we are very thrilled since it's very recently that your book on Rebecca, which actually we own in duplicate, it was published by the British Film Institute, and we were very thrilled to read it. And we wanted to revisit this strangely fascinating film, which proves still, after all those years, to be provocative, problematic in some ways, but also endlessly fascinating. And we would like to start just by putting Rebecca in the context of this very, very special moment, both historically and biographically. Hitchcock goes to America, and he goes to America at a very special time, a very troubled time, and also he starts cooperating with a very special producer. And if we can just start by saying what it meant for Hitchcock to start working with David O. Selznick at this particular moment in time.
Yes, well, thank you for the question and for hosting me. I am thrilled to be talking about Hitchcock's first American film. And he found out that he, as much as he was interested in the American studio system as an opportunity to, expand his reach, to have higher production values, to work with professionals across the board, to work with really strong actors, that it also meant working with a very opinionated, very hands-on producer. So in the 30s, Selznick had established Selznick International Pictures, had sort of taken his formula of luxury filmmaking to his own independent production company, and continued to succeed and to make literary adaptations. And of course, the most spectacular of those was Gone with the Wind, which was still underway when Hitchcock signed with Selznick, when Hitchcock made the move across the Atlantic, and as Rebecca was getting set up and written and even shot. So it was a time of preoccupation for Selznick, which might have been good because he might have interfered even more with Hitchcock getting started. So Selznick, totally knew that he was getting someone of outsized talent. He knew he was getting somebody who could sort of be a director-producer and make his own work happen kind of from start to finish, like Selznick himself liked to do, but they were extremely different in the ways they approached this particular material and filmmaking in general. So, they started their partnership with this film, and it would be kind of stormy throughout, but I think Rebecca turned out probably the better for having both of them, put their best into it, along with, of course, all the other collaborators that Hitchcock was able to kind of hook up with in the US.
I think one of the treasures of your book is that you are trying to, and very successfully, I would say, to decenter Hitchcock as a figure, which is, of course, very refreshing. We started with this, famous duo, right? Hitchcock-Selznick, almost like Astaire and Rogers, as the song went, right? One of the songs from the era. And you are showing and you're arguing that Rebecca actually was let's say, an artistic child of several great women, right? And influential women that were certainly in the background and that we are now only trying to reclaim their influence on Hitchcock. Was that one of the, let's say, reasons or one of the appeals that convinced you want to write about Rebecca among other films? I know it's always a probably interesting process when they ask you to contribute to BFI series, and you write that it was one of your dreams. So what was the reason? Did you choose it? Did somebody offer you to write about Rebecca?
No, in fact, I brought it to the BFI, and they were, it's a wonderful series of small books that initially was based on a list, on a sort of 360 degree or 365 maybe titles that were, essential, and they were going to cycle through them. But at the time that I proposed the book, they were, the BFI publishing had kind of shut down there and was using other publishers. And this series was in transition. So I was trying to get Rebecca made or written for a couple of years while they set up with Bloomsbury. And Rebecca wasn't on the list. One of the reasons was that there had already been some very strong Hitchcock volumes in the series. So, Camille Paglia's On the Birds, for one. And I felt very strongly that Rebecca needed to be in any debates about sort of canonicity, because it clearly, it's not an overlooked film by any means. It won the Oscar. It's had, continual rotation. It was being re-released by Selznick himself. I mean, it was lucrative. It was on television a lot. It's always been in view, but because it's an adaptation of an enormously popular novel by Daphne du Maurier, it's always been a kind of odd Hitchcock out, in the sense that he himself famously kind of disowned it in his interviews with François Truffaut, saying it's not a Hitchcock picture, really. And I think he meant the material. He goes on to say it was, it was women's literature. It was sentimental. It was static. It was, and I think even a little bit, the sort of Gothicness of it was a little, the word that pops into my mind, uncanny to Hitchcock. There was something about that he didn't quite like. He loved he loves the sort of suspense of it. It's a perfect suspense structure for him, but I don't think that it's not only the the sort of, this is a female genre, the female Gothic, but something about the kind of atmosphericness of it, I think was not so attractive to him. But he did jump on it as an opportunity to sign with Selznick. He was looking at the material just as Selznick was, as they were negotiating their deal. So it was kind of a way of putting a team together that, you know, would succeed artistically and at the box office. By acquiring Rebecca and getting it on the slate as their first film together. But I was really attracted to it because of that disavowal on Hitchcock's part, because there was something about its sort of feminine qualities that he wanted to put some distance between himself and, when at the same time, he clearly loves having these kind of imperiled female heroines. Often they're a little more spunky than the one in Rebecca, or a little more, you know, I want to say curious, but I think that the heroine and narrator of Rebecca, is quite curious, but she's also proceeds with enormous caution. So anyway, I insisted that this film would be a great addition because of the Hitchcock Selznick collaboration, and because it would allow us to talk about this Hollywood studio system as a welcoming place for Hitchcock and his team, which included, of course, his wife, Alma Reville, and Joan Harrison. And that the studio system, as much as it was hierarchical and included and segregated and really only had, you know, white male professionals at the top of most categories, did offer opportunities for women, just like any big sort of industry. There were women everywhere in roles like, you know, secretaries and executive assistants and script girls and wardrobe and costume, but there were also more and more women in editing departments, women writers, and even in producing. So I was really interested in that angle on the Hitchcock Selznick team, which was like neither one of these could have floated their work without actually collaborating with women, not just using their work, but collaborating. And that they both understood, as did Hollywood at the time, that the audience of women needed to be addressed in a meaningful way for something to succeed. So I liked that it's an artistic work, but also a commercial work. It's an auteurist work, and there's wonderful exchanges between these two sort of titanic egos, Hitchcock and Selznick, because, you know, it's all documented, but that it also had these other very strong contributions.
Where would you place Rebecca in terms of portraying or maybe projecting contemporary womanhood in America in 1940s? We know that in 1945 there was this national survey in which women voted Rebecca as American women as their favorite picture. And when I'm thinking of films of the 1940s, especially of the wartime era, and we look at, for example, Greer Garson as Mrs. Miniver, this very, you know, resilient woman who is basically, you know, helping survive the war. And here we have this strange, frail creature. I mean, Joan Fontaine, of course, who is so delicate and easily traumatized in many ways. And of course, she harkens back to some Gothic, you know, images and Gothic imagination as such. But where would you place her, this particular image? And you also mentioned it in the book, but in the context of wartime or 1940s womanhood in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, of course, the film is made on the cusp, right? So that the novel comes out in 1938, you know, in the 1930s is a time of enormous productivity on the part of women writers. It's, you know, released as a film in 1940, and it has the darkness, quite literally in the cinematography that would characterize 1940s filmmaking, film noir emerges. And it has this sort of moral cloudiness and, characterological confusion that would characterize films of that era as well. Remember, the film is called Rebecca. So even though the heroine is I venture to say, kind of masochistic and not assertive, as she says, dull and gauche and inexperienced, and no one would gossip about her. She is someone that at least David O. Selznick is on record of saying that every girl identifies with. And obviously that insecurity is both sociologically bred into kind of middle-class womanhood in terms of, being an ideal in terms of looks and brains, beauty and breeding, which Rebecca all has and that narrator does not, but also politically, that she's, that insecurity is a national insecurity, it's wartime. And so I think that sort of psychologically, there's an identification possible with this heroine for anybody because of that, not knowing what the future is going to be, being compelled by sort of the darker aspects of the past, and not really wanting to acknowledge that desire to explore other alternatives. And then there's Rebecca. So do women love Rebecca, the book, or do they love Rebecca, this mysterious figure of obsession that they might want to emulate, that they're attracted to? And of course, in my reading, there's a strong lesbian component to the desire for Rebecca to, figure out her secret, to see what she looks like, to touch the things that she touched, to be part of that. And so Rebecca represents, consumerist desire, but she also represents a kind of female power that isn't in the novel talked about politically, but that certainly, or in the film, there's no political dimension to it. But I think historically, there clearly is a parallel to breaking out of domesticity, to breaking out of predicted gender roles and social hierarchies, and to, deciding her own fate, which Rebecca does even to her death. So that split, I think, is very appropriate to wartime, to the 40s, to the massive social upheaval that would happen. And again, it's right on the cusp of that. So it predicts further films that explore these themes. I think very much the femme fatales of film noir are, manifestations of Rebecca's, the dark hair signifying their treacherousness. And the films that were made for women who were constituting a great portion of the domestic audience in the US, and always had, but there was a sense that now we really can throw all attempts to address, their dates out and just go for the female audience with the, full-on weepies and a lot of the cycle of female Gothics that would come out of Rebecca, including memorably Gaslight, which comes to stand in for that formula. So it's a 1930s creation and a 1940s sort of bellwether.
I think it's also something you suggest in your reading, that this movie was in a way anachronistic even on the day of its release, somehow, because of its visual qualities, because of this Hollywood Gothic, which actually, I would say, puts it also quite close to, Universal horror cycle. Of course, production values are quite different. The style, the sumptuous sets, it's not that level in Universal horrors, but, this phrase Hollywood Gothic kind of sticks in my mind when I think about Rebecca, obviously, and you explore that. So, in a way, this movie was very fresh, sexually subversive, as you write, and I totally agree with your, with lesbian reading, which is a quite classical reading when it comes to Rebecca, but which you explore to a great detail. And thank you for this attention to detail and textures. It really makes the reading experience great. So thank you for that. So I think it's also something quite unique, and also it makes it impossible to remake it as a film, right? It was remade several times, but I think you are very gentle in not discussing the 2020 adaptation of Rebecca, right? Which must emphasize the agency of the heroine. So like this idea that we can have a heroine who doesn't really have much of an agency, maybe it appears in the second half of the film, I think it's something unthinkable nowadays. And maybe that also makes the return to Manderley so fascinating.
Of course, I think of 40 Shades of Grey or something like that, or Twilight. I think there are heroines quite like this. Like I think Bella in Twilight is the kind of descendant of the narrator of Rebecca because of her awkwardness, her lack of a clear outline of what her character is. So I do think there's a little bit of the kind of Oedipal drama of femininity that does still compel, but you're absolutely right that if you try to make a whole film or series of films about that character, you better have a lot of other good stuff going on to put it over. So the 2020 remake of Rebecca hadn't been released yet. I was speculating about how it would work and had a little bit of sort of an analysis of what I thought would happen in terms of intertextuality with the star personae and how they would be used. And I was advised to remove it from the book because it was like, no, this is about the classic. And it turned out well because the film was, I think just pretty much terrible. And and I spoke with, to my mind, the most authoritative Rebecca scholar, Tanya Modleski, about the Rebecca remake. And she eventually published a very fun piece about it, about why the formula doesn't work in this case. And I think the specificity of this film is both its timeliness, as your previous question indicated, like, why is this anxiety so acute at this moment of the beginning of the war and the beginning of these massive changes in gender roles and class and race as well, and migration, everything would change. And its psychic timelessness in the sense of just patriarchy working pretty consistently to offer that female narrator position, that subject position, very little in the way of external goals. And so there's this preoccupation with this sort of inner world, which is quite dominated by other women who are trapped in that same system. So that Gothic formula really does travel the centuries in different formations. But I do think that Rebecca can be remade as a TV show. It does seem to work quite well in these BBC adaptations because there is so much room in the story for other aspects of British class society, and the deliciousness of that Mrs. Danvers character means that we do want to see remakes of Rebecca, even though they will never touch this one.
Well, my fear is that, the next thing will be Rebecca as retold through Mrs. Danvers. Probably there will be a Ryan Murphy show called Danvers or something like that. And about the remake, I mean, it was so bad, but the most fascinating thing about it was how the text of the sort of public biography of Armie Hammer was rewritten because of the sexual scandals afterwards, and suddenly it turned out that he has dark secrets of his own. So in that way, that was the only point of interest for me.
Right, and you don't have to watch the film for that.
Yeah.
Also, I think for all of us who rewatch and watch Rebecca, I think it's also quite seductive that the movie starts with what you call in your book the kind of the discursive eye. And of course, in your book, and is it only my impression, or you are fond of puns as jokes? We are also very fond of puns. So, of course, you use some puns like directly in your book, but also the figure of I, because I think, in other books, for example, I have Murray Pomeranz, A Dream of Hitchcock. She, right? You use I, which is, of course, I as a person, as a character, I as you as a writer, but also I as a I, which looks, and you're very fluent in film theory, so I think it's also kind of an intellectual pun, if I may say so. So I think the challenge that I think was really enormous for you as an author, and for anyone who talks about Rebecca as we do now, is to try to approach the intimacy of this movie. And was it a challenge for you? Did you think about it, or you approached it as another kind of quasi-academic work you had to do? What was the let's say the level of privacy and intimacy that you feel was involved in the endeavor?
Well, I had written about Rebecca before in my first book, Uninvited, and I talk about having watched the film as a teenager. And to me, that in both senses, the sort of forming of my taste as a scholar for studying both gender and cinema of the past, at least, was my interest at the time, classical Hollywood. So I was training my eye to understand what these worlds were like and what was so compelling about these worlds, even when they didn't have, modern heroines, because of course that was, something I also was interested in seeing. So I feel very close to the heroine of the novel, and the film, and to also be that I, even intermittently, writing this study was extremely appealing to me. So that I feel like that the BFI books, and I should say that now the list has been thrown out with the newest iteration, and there are, books on all kinds of aspects of world cinema that wouldn't have made that first canonical selection. But I felt that it's a space for writing in an essayistic mode, which is a public eye, and for the kind of film analysis that I'd been trained to do, and the historical research that would be so pleasurable with a film like this, because it's just so well documented. So I approached it absolutely wanting to write in a maybe poetic style, nothing like the atmosphericness of Daphne du Maurier herself, but to remember that the literary qualities of that book do infuse the film, and even more than the opening and lack of closing voiceover, that there's a lot about the point of view, the I, that is essential to the success of the film, and that goes back to the question we were discussing about being split between that narrating presence, or that, questing, looking, because her eye is so important. Her gaze is so important in the film, but is so frustrated at every turn. She barely gets reverse shots. She barely sees around, she can't see around corners. She doesn't know what people want. She is not a good looker in many senses. So I thought that would be a very rewarding way to write about film, is to explore that space between the literary and the, I guess, audiovisual, if you will.
I think it's really also for us as makers of this podcast, it's a unique moment because we tried to compare some previous novels or plays with what Hitchcock made in his British period. And, it's a more or less a futile task. Of course, we compared with Joseph Conrad, who was born as a Polish, man, then started writing in English. So it's another incredible transformation. But basically, I didn't have this pleasure of comparing the novel and adaptation, and as you do in your book. But this time I listened to the book, actually. There is this great audiobook which is read in an incredible way. I mean,
is it Anna Massey that reads? Did you listen to it?
Yes.
So she plays Mrs. Danvers in the first TV version of it that I saw as a young person. So, and you of course probably know her as a Hitchcock actress too. So anyway, it's a wonderful, I love listening to Du Maurier. That's the only way to do it if you're an American, because otherwise you don't hear the British accent.
Yeah, so you approach it as an American, right? You don't have kind of like British connections, right? I mean, for me as a Polish listener, it was also fascinating, and the oral version, takes you to a different world, right? And this is something that, of course, Hitchcock couldn't really, and you write about it, he couldn't really have that in the film. I mean, it's translated on a visual level. You write about the camera work, which is doing this arabesque moves in the cabin by the sea. So he translates that into visuals, but I totally agree that the spirit of Du Maurier, although it's very dated for me as a like this, almost like a millennial, right? For me, reading or listening to that book is a unique experience. And I must say, kind of countering the author theory, that I'm really happy that Hitchcock had this kind of breaks put on him, that he really had to stay more or less close to the original, because I think like Rebecca the movie and Rebecca the novel, they can go together. It's a really a unique phenomenon. And I also was curious by your suggestions that Du Maurier was kind of this butch, right? This more of a butch. I mean, in your book there is the picture of this writer, and she looks almost like Ernest Hemingway, right? Writing. I mean, I was surprised by it. But also, there's one thing that I was thinking about, and that you don't address, and I don't think anybody pays attention to that, because this movie and this novel is all about doubles, right? As many Hitchcock films, and not only Hitchcock films, are about. And here we have many doubles. You point to Jack Favell and Mrs. Danvers, and to the actors who play them as this, they introduce this campy, queer sensibility to the film. But I was wondering, this is the question kind of to both of you, what do you think about the relationship between Max de Winter and Frank? Do you sense there also this touch of homosexual fascination as a kind of doubling the Mrs. Danvers Rebecca pair? What do you think about it?
His friend Frank Crawley?
Yeah.
Yes, and I don't deal with him much in the book, and I'm very selective, because I'm like, there's all that stuff going on with Maxim. That's that's the investigative plot. But it's almost a romance when they have a secret. We think that Frank knows what really happened to Rebecca. They have a moment where Maxim is going to say something to Frank, and Frank tells him, forget about it. I know, it's okay. I understand. That basically he's got away with murder. And then they're in the car together. They're the couple that watches, Manderley burning from a hill at the end, which is what happens in the book. So with the heterosexual couple, with Maxim and I. So I do think it's set up sort of that kind of gentleman relationship that is homosocial and perhaps homosexual. And in Du Maurier's oeuvre, there's a lot of interest in male protagonists. And in some ways, I think Maxim, at least biographically, is more like her than either of the women, or any of the women, I should say. Notably, there are three, and even more if you count Beatrice. So I think that it isn't campy, but it's structural in the way that the film kind of pairs them in a world that is changing away from the sort of, Lord of the Manor patriarchy that Maxim grew up in, but that is no longer prevalent or, viable. And that they can't find a place outside of Manderley either, so they're kind of rootless, and that the women really own that domestic space because it's, even if it's anachronistic, it's kind of where they've exercised their power. It's where they've critiqued patriarchal ownership and lineage. So I think there is a kind of gendered space that you could explore in that way that would be interesting. And it would be appealing to Hitchcock too, I think, because he wanted to keep more of the film like in the kind of English countryside and make it less isolated and Gothic. And I think those little moments of exchange with the many lovely British character actors in this, city and in the plot of investigation where he appears, where he makes his cameo, is outside a phone booth, where George Saunders is as Jack Fauvel is calling Danny. That part appealed to him, and the Gothic is realm, I think, would be. Maxim doesn't really have the standing in his ancestral home that he should. And I think it's very notable that he doesn't even appear in the upper floors of Manderley at all. He kind of stands at the bottom of the staircase most of the time, kind of like, this is mine, but can't, master any of its secrets or its history or its future.
It's fascinating, and I also wanted to ask, slowly drawing to the end, about your experience of teaching and speaking about Hitchcock with younger viewers, because, we are in 2021, unbelievably so, but yes, and so pretty much, in 20 or 19 years from now, we'll be celebrating the 100 years of Rebecca, even though it seems ridiculous, but it's we're drawing slowly to that anniversary. And but I wanted to ask about your experience of talking to students or younger people born, let's say, around 2000 who are approaching this film, and what were your experiences of them encountering this, I think, a world that is so alien to their own experience and frame of reference?
Yeah, both in terms of just historically and in terms of gender. Well, Sebastian, you mentioned the complementarity of the book and the novel. So I do tend to teach them together, and it's really one of the few novels I continue to teach in my film classes, because it's such a good example of immersiveness, and then the immersiveness of the film and how that works. So I did teach it this year. And what I enjoy about it is, everything about the Hollywood classical production values and good acting and, world building captures them. So even if they come into a class saying they've never seen a black and white film, they're instantly there with these characters, and they have their loves and hates and critiques. And so while they do find the heroine insufferable, which I always am a little offended about, because I'm like, but she's Joan Fontaine and she's so sweet and she's, you know, they love the setup. They're really into the kink. They're into the how explicit the daddy stuff is. They're into how defiant Rebecca is, and they're into the sort of deliciousness of Danvers. I mean, they hate her, but they also don't hate her the way I feel like they used to when I taught the book maybe 15 years ago. Like, they're much more into the villainy of queerness being kind of a pleasurable revenge. And so it's quite interesting how easy it is to teach. And the book they find long, which everyone does. I mean, Hitchcock was like, how tedious is this book? But it's so familiar to them. They instantly talk about Twilight, or a sort of fan fiction kind of world where these characters are very familiar, and they also really, they know their steampunk and their horror worlds that, I mean, students will come in saying, but women are so powerful in horror. And I was like, wait, that isn't how it taught, before. They're like, no, this is like horror where women get to be monsters. And I'm like, okay, that's a nice critical shift. So it's rewarding, and they are judgmental, but I think that's also baked into the book, and the film too, where you're like meant to have an extreme reaction to Danvers, for example. And it helps that Laurence Olivier plays Maxim in the film, because I think if he had been one of the Maxims that you see in the TV versions, where they really are like old, that it's less compelling.
I have one question, which is purely on a like this cinephilic level, let's say, like on a level of a cinephile's experience, because your conclusion of your analysis, the way you analyze the last scenes is very powerful. But I think it's characteristic to all of the people who are writing about Rebecca that they somehow are not so much interested. And you're right that the half an hour of this procedural game is kind of a dull, as you write it, and I agree. So I have this feeling that Rebecca, let's say, I feel as a viewer that it's a great film, but I don't consider it a masterpiece, because when they leave Manderley, it flattens. But it has to, right? Because you cannot sustain this kind of visual ecstasy, fetishism that is there in Manderley, because you have a regular plot then. Do you think it's kind of a flaw of Rebecca? Because you write just 2 pages about this half an hour after Max confesses. So that's my question about what's left out of your narrative in this case.
Yes, so I guess in that way it is sort of like a fan version. Like if we just came, had that business dealt with more quickly, it would be. I didn't have a chance because of COVID to get deeply into the archive. I could just search for things that were identifiable in the finding aids and that the archivists could kind of identify with. So it's unclear to me whether the mechanics of that were a choice of Hitchcock to have some, kind of forward momentum of the plot, or to have, stuff happen, or maybe Selznick, who was so devoted to the book. But I think it's important ideologically that the law is on Maxim's side in a way that really, I don't think Hitchcock would even like, it makes it is really awful that he can get away with this. So I think that's very important. The return to Manderley at the end, which feels to me unsatisfying in some ways, although very beautifully executed and it returns us to the world of, as you said, the kind of mise en scène that is so appealing. By watching Danvers kind of travel through the house and then meet her death, that is the open-endedness of the film to me, because it doesn't return to the voiceover and kind of is not able to integrate that whole investigative plot into a satisfying ending, is part of the enduringness of the film, because it can't figure out how to resolve everything that it's raised. And that is the classic Gothic scenario.
I think it's perfect for us to end on this note of ambiguity, because the ambiguity remains there, and I think we can feel it every time we watch Rebecca, and we are confronted with just ultimately unresolved many of the tensions that the film creates but they remain so powerful, and they retain their power for hopefully future generations that will be guided also by your wonderful study. So thank you so much for the book, and thank you again for appearing on this podcast.
Thank you so much. The pleasure's mine, and there's obviously so much more to say. So I look forward to the rest of your podcast.
It was a fantastic opportunity to talk to Professor White, and I feel like rewatching Rebecca again on a Criterion disc that I recently purchased. I guess this is a movie, one of those Hitchcock movies like Vertigo, that you can really revisit many times.
Exactly, and the way you change, the movie also changes with you. So for me, revisiting Rebecca was a unique experience. I also wanted to add, because I didn't have time in our conversation, that my grandmother, may she rest in peace, that was her favorite movie. So, and it was actually maybe many grandmothers' favorite movie. This movie has something like that in it. It's a cult movie, probably the first really cult classic that Hitchcock made, that has this appeal and that really takes people back in time and place. So I would like to remember about my grandmother when we are discussing Rebecca.
Well, thank you so much for listening to this episode, and we always encourage you to check out other episodes, to check out our Facebook page, Foreign Correspondents, Deeper into Hitchcock, and please share the episodes. We are really crafting them with love and devotion to Mr. Hitchcock. And we can also say, and that's another exciting episode that's coming up, because the next episode will be Foreign Correspondent, so the very movie that gave the title to our podcast, and a movie that I really always enjoy. So next time we will be still in the year 1940, but in a more, let's say, picaresque, adventurous mode with Joel Magria and others in Foreign Correspondents. So thank you so much for listening to our podcast, Foreign Correspondents,
Deeper into Hitchcock.